The air was thick enough to taste. Thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and the wild, thrumming energy of 200 wolves packed together under the full moon. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum trying to beat its way out of her chest. Tonight, everything would change. It had to, because if it didn't, she didn't know how she would survive another day of being nothing. A ghost. An Omega named Lucy. Deep down, she knew the truth was that hope was a dangerous thing, a flickering candle in a hurricane. Yet, she clung to the seer's prophecy like a drowning woman clings to a splinter of wood. You are fated for the Alpha, child. Your bond will secure the future of the Silverwood Pack. More importantly, she clung to a memory, a secret whisper from a lifetime ago, when Kale wasn't the Pack's golden god, but just a boy with mud on his knees. He had found her crying by the creek after the bigger kids had torn her doll. Don't worry, Lucy, he had promised, pressing a smooth river stone into her palm. One day I'll be Alpha, and I'll make sure no one ever makes you cry again. She still had that stone tucked away, a silly, childish treasure. Maybe it was fate that she was standing here now on the far edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows of an ancient oak. Her worn tunic was a smudge of brown in a sea of proud, strong bodies. Across the way, Kale stood beside his father, the current Alpha. He was breathtaking. All golden hair and confident power, his presence a physical force that made the very air around him seem to bend. He hadn't looked at her once, not a single glance. He was too busy accepting the fawning praise of the Pack's elite warriors. It shouldn't have hurt. But it did. Before she could move, a low, unfamiliar scent cut through the air. Something sharp and wild, like ozone after a lightning strike in old, dark forests. Her eyes were drawn to the visiting delegation from the Shadowfang Pack, their sworn enemies, here for a tense treaty renewal. They were different, larger. Their stillness was that of predators, not of disciplined soldiers. And at their center stood their Alpha, Reese. He was a nightmare carved from shadow and scars, his black hair stirring in the breeze, his eyes a shocking, inhuman gold. And he wasn't looking at Kale or the Alpha or the ceremony. He was looking directly at her. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air traced a path down her spine. Why was he looking at her? What could he possibly see in a Pax Omega? Still dreaming, Lucy? A voice sneered beside her. It was Mara, another Omega, her face pinched with a familiar jealousy. He doesn't even know you exist. Lucy flinched but didn't answer. He will, she thought fiercely. The goddess will make him see. As if summoned by her prayer, Alpha Marcus raised his hands. Let the great moon bear witness, he boomed. A hush fell. The energy in the clearing coalesced, a tingling wave that washed over everyone. Lucy's breath caught, and then she felt it, a pull, sharp and undeniable, originating from deep in her soul. A shimmering, incandescent thread of pure golden light spun into existence, a luminous spider silk that stretched from her chest across the entire clearing and connected directly to Kale. A collective gasp. 1,000 heartbeats stuttered at once. It was real. The prophecy. It was real. A dizzying, overwhelming joy surged through her. She took a step forward, out of the shadows, her eyes locked on Kale, her fated mate, her Alpha, her savior. But the look on his face wasn't joy. It wasn't love. It was utter horror, disgust. In the span of a breath, he strode forward, his handsome face twisted into a cruel mask. The moment their eyes locked, her world tilted. His voice, when it came, was not a lover's whisper, but a pronouncement of doom that echoed through the stunned silence. No. The word was a gunshot. I, Kale, son of Alpha Marcus, future Alpha of the Silverwood Pack, reject this bond. Her heart didn't just skip a beat, it stopped. The moon goddess must be blind, he roared for all to hear. Our pack deserves a Luna of strength, of power, not a weak, worthless Omega. He raised his hand, his fingers clawed. With a vicious snarl, he slashed through the golden thread that connected them. Shatter. The sound wasn't physical, but it ripped through her soul, a violent, tearing agony that stole the air from her lungs. The golden light dissolved into nothing. The pull in her chest vanished, replaced by a hollow, bleeding void. The world swam, a blur of shocked faces, pitying looks, and cruel, triumphant smirks. Her knees buckled. He had not just rejected her. He had judged her. He had condemned her. Her entire life, her entire sense of self, had been built on that single thread of fate, and he had severed it as easily as breaking a twig. In that moment, as the silence roared around her, her gaze lifted one last time, skittering past the horror-struck face of her alpha, past the pitying eyes of her pack, until it landed once more on the Shadowfang alpha. Rhys hadn't moved. He was still watching her, but his expression had changed. The cold assessment was gone, replaced by something else, something dark and predatory and interested. It was the look of a wolf that had just seen its prey, wounded and separated from the herd. And just like that, everything changed. A new kind of terror, colder and sharper than humiliation, pierced through her shock. She didn't know what scared her more, the man who had just destroyed her life, or the one who looked at her like he was about to begin it. She had to run, not from them, not from Cale. She had to run from the ghost of a girl who had ever believed in prophecies. Her body moved on instinct, a desperate, tearing flight from the sound of her own soul shattering. One moment, she was the center of 1,000 pairs of eyes. The next, she was a blur of motion, a ghost fleeing its own grave. The jeers and shocked whispers of her pack, her former pack, faded behind her, swallowed by the pounding of her own blood in her ears. Twigs and sharp branches clawed at her face and arms, leaving angry red lines on her skin, but she didn't feel them. All she felt was the gaping, bleeding wound in her chest where Cale's bond used to be. The empty space was a vacuum, sucking all the warmth and light from the world. Worthless. The word echoed with Cale's voice. Weak. Omega. She ran harder, faster, pushing her legs until her muscles screamed in protest. Tears streamed from her eyes, freezing on her cheeks in the cold night air. Her lungs burned, each gasp for air a fresh agony. But then, she didn't want to breathe. Because of that, she pushed herself even harder, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling the full, crushing weight of what had just happened. Truth be told, a part of her wanted her heart to just give out, to stop beating and grant her the peace of oblivion. Was there a worse fate than being rejected by the one person the universe had chosen for you? Without thinking, her wolf surged forward, demanding control. The shift was messy, a chaotic explosion of instinct and pain rather than a smooth transformation. Bone and sinew snapped and reformed. In the span of a breath, she was on 4 paws, her smaller, sleeker wolf form a flash of silver-brown fur against the dark forest floor. The ground flew beneath her paws. The world became a smear of greens and blacks, the scent of her own terror, a bitter tang in the air. Still, she ran. She ran from the golden boy with the cruel eyes. She ran from the pity of her family, and she ran from the memory of that shimmering, beautiful thread of light that had promised her everything and given her nothing. Just like that, she burst through the familiar line of ancient pines that marked the edge of Silverwood territory. Instead of stopping, instead of turning back toward the only home she had ever known, she kept going. She crossed the invisible border into the Shadowfang wilds. The moment she entered their lands, the very air changed. It grew colder, heavier, charged with a primal energy that felt ancient and menacing. The trees here were different. Not the proud, straight sentinels of her home woods, but gnarled, twisted things that seemed to lean in and watch her with a malevolent intelligence. The forest held its breath. There were no birds, no scurrying sounds of small animals. There was only the sound of her own ragged panting and the sigh of the wind through skeletal branches. Eventually, the fire in her muscles turned to lead. The adrenaline that had fueled her flight bled away, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound, it felt like death. Her wolf form faltered. With a final stumbling gait, she collapsed behind a thicket of thorns, the shift back to her human form leaving her naked, shivering, and pathetically weak on the cold, damp earth. And then the sobs came. They weren't quiet tears. They were ugly, gut-wrenching sounds torn from the deepest part of her soul. A wail of a creature that had lost everything. What was there to go back to? A pack that saw her as a curse? A family that had already turned away in shame? A fated mate who considered her less than dust beneath his feet? Each question was a fresh stab of pain. Deep down, she knew the truth. There was nothing. She was nothing. The prophecy had not been a promise. It had been a cruel joke played by a merciless goddess. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the image of Kale's face, twisted in disgust, or the feeling of the bond shattering into a million pieces inside her. The memory was a physical thing, a shard of ice lodged permanently in her heart. As the silence stretched after her cries faded to whimpers, a sound cut through the air. Snap. The sound of a dry twig breaking under a heavy foot. Her head shot up, eyes wide with a fresh surge of terror. Her wolf pressed forward within her, a growl rising in her throat, every instinct screaming a single, primal word. Predator. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the trees, impossibly large, impossibly silent. She was no longer alone. He emerged from the gloom not like a wolf, but like the night itself given form. Reese, the Shadow Fang Alpha. Under the weight of his stare, the air thickened, heavy and electric. He was even more terrifying up close. A web of old, faded scars decorated the hard planes of his face and his golden eyes. They didn't just look at her, they seemed to strip her down to her bones, to see every pathetic, shivering fear she possessed. Her heart skipped. Then it started hammering again, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She scrambled backward, trying to make herself smaller, but her back hit the rough bark of a tree. Trapped. There was nowhere to go. He stopped a dozen feet away, his presence so immense it felt like he was sucking all the air out of the forest. The space between them burned with a silent, terrifying intensity. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer a threat. He simply watched her, his head tilted in a gesture of keen, analytical curiosity. What followed was a voice, not a roar or a shout, but a low, deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. "They threw away a diamond," he said, his golden eyes glittering in the faint moonlight, "because they were too foolish to see past the dust." Her thoughts spun. What did that mean? What diamond? Was he talking about her? Before the words left her lips, before she could even form a question, he moved. It wasn't a run. It wasn't a lunge. It was a disappearance. Between one breath and the next, he closed the distance between them, a blur of shadow and controlled power. Her breath caught. Without warning, he was there, looming over her. She felt the heat radiating from his body, smelled the intoxicating, dangerous scent of ozone and wild, ancient power. Her wolf shrieked within her, a scream built in her throat, but it never escaped. He pinned her. Not with a brutal slam, but with an inescapable, deliberate weight that crushed the air from her lungs. His face was inches from hers, those terrifying golden eyes boring into her very soul. And then, he lowered his head to her neck. She felt the ghost of a touch, the press of his lips against her frantic pulse. And then, fire. Agony. His fangs, sharper than any blade, pierced the tender flesh above her shoulder. A scream was torn from her throat as the bite sank deep, a searing, white-hot pain that eclipsed everything. But then, something else happened. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, a new power, dark, possessive, and overwhelmingly potent, surged from his bite, pouring into the hollow, bleeding void Kale had left behind. It didn't heal the wound. It conquered it. It branded it. A new bond, 1,000 times stronger and wilder than the golden thread of fate, slammed into place, tethering her soul to his with chains of shadow and fire. It was not a comfort. It was a claim. It was a brand. Her world dissolved into a roaring, white-hot haze. Her last coherent thought, as her consciousness shattered, was the terrifying, undeniable truth. One cage had just been replaced by another. Her first sensation was the scratch of rough fur against her cheek. Her next was a dull, throbbing ache in her neck, a constant humming fire that felt both foreign and intimately a part of her. As her eyes fluttered open, the world swam into a blurry focus of stone walls and flickering firelight. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else. Something wild and musky that spoke of power. This wasn't the polished, comfortable Silverwood den. This was a cave, a lair. With every heartbeat, the reality of her situation came crashing back. The rejection, the flight, the terrifying golden eyes in the dark. Her hand flew to her neck, and her fingers brushed against a raised, intricate pattern of hardened skin where his teeth had been. The mark tingled at her touch, a phantom echo of the bond that now held her soul captive. It felt like a brand. Before she could move, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a tall, lean she-wolf with sharp features and eyes as gray and unforgiving as a winter storm. Her posture was rigid, her contempt a palpable force in the room. "So," the she-wolf said, her voice clipped and cold. "The alpha's new pet is awake." Lucy flinched, trying to sit up, pulling the fur pelt tighter around her naked body. Where am I?" Her own voice was a dry, raspy whisper. "You're in the heart of the Shadowfang Den, little Omega," the she-wolf sneered, crossing her arms. Her name was Brenna, Reese's beta, and she looked at Lucy as if she were something crawled out from under a rock. "Though for how long is anyone's guess? Don't get too comfortable." What does he want with me?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. Brenna let out a short, harsh laugh. "Who knows what the Alpha wants? He is ancient, and his reasons are his own. But I know what the Pack wants, and it isn't a weak cast-off stray from our enemies." She took a step closer, her lip curling. "You smell of Silverwood fear. It's pathetic." Her chest ached. The scorn was so familiar, yet coming from this powerful, dangerous wolf, it felt 100 times sharper. What's worse, she knew Brenna was right. She was weak. She was pathetic. Because of that, she couldn't find the words to defend herself. At the same time, the heavy wooden door creaked open, and the air in the room instantly changed. It crackled. It grew heavy. Reese entered, and his presence dwarfed everything else. Brenna immediately fell silent, her defiant posture melting into one of tense, respectful deference. His golden eyes swept the room, landing on Lucy. He gave Brenna a look so slight it was barely perceptible, but it was enough. Without another word, the beta turned and stalked out of the room. In the quiet that followed, Reese approached the hearth. He picked up a chunk of bread and a water skin from the mantel and placed them on the floor beside Lucy, his movements deliberate and devoid of any softness. "Eat," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. "Your new life requires strength." His words were not a comfort. They were an order, and they left a terrifying question hanging in the air between them. Strength for what? An hour later, the bread and water remained untouched. Lucy sat huddled in the furs, a prisoner in a stone cage, the humming mark on her neck a constant reminder of her new owner. Her thoughts spun in a dizzying loop of fear and confusion. Why bring her here? Why claim her? Was this some cruel punishment, some political game she couldn't understand? No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make sense of it. Her instincts surged, telling her to be small, to be quiet, to not draw attention. It was how she had survived her whole life as an Omega. So, she tried to focus on something, anything, else. Her gaze landed on a collection of weapons hanging on the far wall. Axes, swords, and a single, wicked-looking dagger with a hilt carved from dark, gnarled wood. As if pulled by a string, she found herself walking towards it, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just a desperate need for distraction. But she reached out a trembling hand and let her fingertips brush against the dagger's hilt. Fire. The world exploded. It wasn't a thought. It was a violent sensory assault. She smelled the searing heat of a forge, heard the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel. A moment later, she felt the calloused, powerful grip of a Lycan warrior's hand closing around the hilt. His hilt. The scene shifted. She was in a battle, the scent of blood and sweat thick in the air. She heard the death rattle of a wild boar, its tusks sharp and deadly. Then the roar of a rival wolf. The dagger plunged, and she felt the sickening crunch of bone, the hot spray of blood. With a choked cry, Lucy snatched her hand back, stumbling away from the wall as if she'd been burned. She fell to the floor, her body shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. What was that? Her mind reeled. It was more than a memory. She had felt it, lived it. The terror was so absolute she thought she might be going insane. She recoiled from the weapon because the history it held felt more real, more solid, than the stone floor beneath her trembling knees. As the echo faded, the door creaked open again. Rhys stood there, his imposing frame filling the doorway. And his golden eyes were narrowed, fixed on her with a sharp, calculating intensity that made her blood run cold. He hadn't seen her touch the dagger, but he had seen the aftermath, and there was no surprise on his face. There was only confirmation. He strode into the room, his gaze flicking from her terrified face to the dagger on the wall. Without taking his eyes off her, he reached out, took the weapon from its hook, and turned it over in his hand. The air thickened. "What?" he demanded, his voice dangerously soft. "Did you see?" What followed was not an explanation, but an escalation. Rhys all but dragged her from the room and into the cold morning air, to a hard-packed dirt arena behind the den. The space was circled by grim-faced Lycan warriors who watched her with open hostility. Without ceremony, Rhys tossed a heavy wooden practice sword at her feet. It landed with a dull thud. "Pick it up," he commanded. Her voice trembled. I don't know how to fight. I'm an Omega." "Not anymore," he said, the words cutting through the air like shards of ice. "You are the Luna of the Shadowfang now, and this pack does not tolerate weakness, not in its alphas, and not in its Lunas." Under the weight of his stare, she shakily bent and picked up the sword. It felt heavy and awkward in her hands. Before she could even get a proper grip, he attacked. He moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. He didn't use his full strength, but he didn't need to. A simple flick of his wrist sent her sword flying from her grasp. A light shove sent her sprawling into the dirt. He waited for her to retrieve her sword, and the moment she was upright, he did it again, and again, and again. Pain bloomed across her body. Dust and humiliation were a bitter paste in her mouth. The Lycans watching started to chuckle, their amusement a fresh layer of agony. He was not her teacher. He was her tormentor. He was her only hope. After what felt like an eternity, she lay in the dirt, tears of frustration and pain streaking through the grime on her face. She didn't get up. "I can't," she sobbed, the words muffled by the ground. "I can't do this." The laughter stopped. The air grew cold, the silence more menacing than any sound. A pair of heavy leather boots appeared in her line of sight. Rhys loomed over her, a mountain of shadow and disapproval. "You can," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous command that vibrated through her bones. "Or you can die here." She looked up at him, shocked. "Truth be told," he continued, his golden eyes burning with a terrible fire, "you have no other choice. Your old pack will hunt you for the shame you brought them. My pack will challenge and kill you for being weak. Kyle left you to be a victim." He knelt, forcing her to meet his gaze. The space between them burned. "I am giving you the chance to be a weapon." The intensity in his eyes was absolute, leaving no room for argument, no room for anything but the horrifying weight of his words. "Now," he snarled, the sound a promise and a threat all in one. "Get up." Something inside her shifted. Standing on that training ground, bruised and bleeding with his challenge echoing in the air, become a weapon or remain a victim, A tiny, cold ember of resolve began to glow within the ashes of her despair. So, she got up. And the next day, she got up again. What followed was a week of pure, unrelenting agony. Every muscle in her body screamed, and every night she collapsed into her furs, too exhausted to even dream. Still, she learned. She learned how to hold a sword without it trembling, how to parry a clumsy blow, how to fall and rise again. She was still weak, still pathetic compared to them, but she was no longer brittle. She was beginning to bend instead of break. That night, during the evening meal in the great hall, the tension was a physical thing. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and the low rumble of Lycan conversation. Lucy sat at the edge of the long table, trying to make herself small when Brenna's sharp voice cut through the noise. "Look at her!" The beta sneered to the warrior next to her, though her voice was loud enough for half the hall to hear. "The little silverwood mouse pretending to be one of us. How long until her weakness gets one of our own killed?" A few Lycans chuckled. Her chest ached, the familiar shame threatening to swallow her whole. But then, Reese's words echoed in her mind. A weapon. A weapon needed to see the battlefield clearly. It needed to understand the enemy. And right now, Brenna was her enemy. Instead of cowering, Lucy closed her eyes and focused. She remembered the dagger, the chaotic flood of sensation. This time, she wouldn't just let it happen, she would guide it. She pushed her consciousness out, a fragile tendril of thought, and aimed it directly at Brenna. The world tilted. She felt the rough texture of the wooden bench beneath Brenna's hands, tasted the ale on her tongue, and she felt the anger, a simmering, constant fire. But beneath it, there was something else, a deep, hollow grief. Lucy pushed deeper, and then she saw it, a memory, raw and bleeding. Brenna, younger, her face wild with terror, watching a chaotic battle by a riverbank. A silverwood warrior, huge and brutal, cutting down a handsome blonde Lycan who had been fighting back-to-back with her. "Corin!" Brenna's silent scream was a sound of pure agony. She felt Brenna's heart shatter, a pain so familiar it resonated with the broken pieces of her own soul. With a gasp, Lucy pulled back, her own heart hammering. She opened her eyes. Brenna was still looking at her, a contemptuous smirk on her face. But Lucy didn't see a bully anymore. She saw a warrior still grieving the mate she had lost in a border skirmish years ago. Leaning forward slightly, Lucy spoke, her voice barely a whisper, meant only for the beta. "The Battle of the Weeping River." Brenna's smirk froze. "He had blonde hair," Lucy continued softly. "Your mate, Corin. I'm sorry." As if fate demanded it, the change in Brenna was instantaneous and absolute. The color drained from her face. Her hard, gray eyes widened in utter, horrified shock. The tough, cynical mask she wore shattered, revealing the raw, vulnerable pain beneath. In the span of a breath, the entire hall seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them locked in a stunned, terrible silence. The tension broke with the slam of the great hall doors. A Shadowfang scout, his arm bleeding freely from a deep gash, stumbled inside, his chest heaving. "Alpha!" he gasped out. "Silverwood Patrol! They're massing at the northern border! Dozens of them!" He swayed, and two warriors rushed to support him. "They're led by Kale." When her name left his lips, a chill went through the hall. Every eye turned to Reese. Then, like a slow turning tide, they all turned to Lucy. She felt like a bug under a lens. What's worse, she knew they were all thinking the same thing. She had brought this trouble to their doorstep. Reese rose from his seat at the head of the table, his movements calm and deliberate, a stark contrast to the sudden, tense energy in the room. His golden eyes found hers, and there was no mistaking the command in them. He didn't have to speak. He was deploying his weapon. "Find out why they are here," he ordered, his voice a low rumble that cut through the rising panic. Lucy's pulse raced. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and pushed her mind out, past the stone walls of the den, over the dark, whispering canopy of the forest. She searched for the familiar arrogance, the scent of silverwood power, and then she found it. She connected to the mind of a warrior near the front, feeling his smug loyalty. And through him, she heard Kale. His voice wasn't a sound, but a thought, a command projected to his inner circle. "We are not here to start a war," Kale's thought echoed, cold and clear. "We are here to reclaim what is mine. That Omega. The seer now says she holds an unimaginable power within her. I was a fool to cast it aside." Her breath caught. "We will retrieve the asset," Kale continued, the word landing like a physical blow. "And then we will see what she is truly capable of under proper control." Asset. Control. The words ripped through her. That last, stupid, fragile ember of hope, the one that whispered he might have felt a shred of regret for her, was instantly and violently extinguished. He didn't miss her. He didn't regret breaking her heart. He regretted throwing away a valuable tool. Her fury was cold and absolute because it was finally clean, untainted by the ghost of love or hope. This was a betrayal deeper than a broken bond. It was a denial of her very existence as a person. She ripped herself from the vision, her eyes flying open. They were no longer the soft, fearful eyes of an Omega. They were hard and sharp, glittering with an icy, dangerous rage. She looked straight at Rhys. "He doesn't want me," she said, her voice shaking not with fear, but with a fury so profound it felt like it could level mountains. "He wants to put me in a cage." Without another word, Rhys gestured for her to follow. He led her from the now buzzing Great Hall, up a winding stone staircase to a secluded balcony carved into the side of the mountain. The wind was sharp up here, whipping her hair across her face, but it felt good. It felt clean. Below them, the Shadowfang Den was a hive of activity as warriors prepared for a fight. "Tell me everything," Rhys commanded, his back to her as he stared out into the darkness. So she did. She repeated Kale's words, her voice steady and cold as she relayed his intent. The word asset hung in the air between them, ugly and sharp. In the quiet that followed, Rhys finally turned to face her. Beneath the moonlight, his scars seemed deeper, his ancient eyes holding a profound weariness she had never seen before. "He is a fool," Rhys said, the statement a simple fact. "A fool who has just declared war." He paused, his gaze searching her face. "Do you know why I need your power so badly, Lucy?" She shook her head, her anger momentarily forgotten, replaced by curiosity. "Centuries ago," he began, his voice dropping, "I was a young alpha, arrogant, like him. I believed our strength was absolute." He told her a story of a long and bitter winter, of dwindling food and a rival clan. But the real danger had come from within. "My own cousin betrayed us. He led our enemies through a secret pass for a promise of power. I lost my brother, my beta. Half my pack died in a single night of fire and blood, because I couldn't see the truth that was right in front of me." His pain was a raw, living thing in the air. For the first time, she saw the man behind the terrifying alpha, a leader haunted by his oldest failure. "I have spent my life ensuring this pack would never be so vulnerable again," he continued, his voice tight. "I searched for a seer, a prophet, a dreamwalker, someone who could see the daggers hiding in the shadows." As the truth unraveled, she understood. He hadn't claimed her out of simple cruelty. He had claimed her out of a desperate, painful need to protect his people. She was the answer to his deepest fear. The knowledge was a strange mix of violation and validation. She was a tool, yes, but a vital one, a necessary one. The captor and captive dynamic between them cracked, replaced by something far more complex, a fragile, dangerous alliance. He needed her to protect his pack, and she needed him to survive Kale. "Kale will not stop until he has you," Rhys said, his golden eyes burning with a new intensity. "And I will not let him have you. You are a weapon, yes." He took a step closer, the space between them humming with unspoken energy. "But you are my weapon." He paused, and for a fleeting second, his gaze softened. "The question is, will you fight with me, or will you let him drag you back to your cage?" The wind on the high balcony whipped a strand of dark hair across her face, but Lucy didn't notice. His question hung in the charged air between them, heavy and absolute. "Will you fight with me, or will you let him drag you back to your cage?" A cage. That's what Silverwood had been. A pretty gilded cage of prophecy and expectation where she was groomed to be a prize. Then Cale had shattered it, only to decide he wanted to build her a new one, smaller and stronger, where she would exist only as an extension of his will. A weapon he could wield, a thing he could own. Her wolf stirred, a low growl of pure, unadulterated fury rising in her throat. Deep down, she knew the truth. The choice wasn't between two alphas. It was between being a possession and becoming a person. She met Reese's intense golden gaze, and for the first time, she did not flinch. "I will fight," she said, her voice clear and steady, a vow made to him, and more importantly, to herself. What followed was Cale's predictable arrogance. By the time the sun was high the next day, a formal envoy from the Silverwood pack had arrived at the border, demanding an audience. Reese met them in the shadow of the Great Gate, with the entire Shadowfang pack assembled behind him. Lucy stood at his side, not behind him. The envoy, a pompous warrior named Lucian she'd known her whole life, puffed out his chest. "Alpha Reese," he began, his tone condescending. "Alpha Cale demands the immediate return of the Omega, Lucy. She is a stolen asset of the Silverwood pack, and he is prepared to take any measures necessary to retrieve his property." The word property sent a fresh wave of ice through Lucy's veins. A low, dangerous rumble went through the Shadowfang warriors. They were a primal pack, and while they might not trust her, they understood the insult of one alpha trying to claim what another had already marked. All eyes were on Reese, waiting for his thunderous rejection. But then, before either could speak, Lucy took a single step forward. The movement was small, but it was a seismic shift in power. The envoy's eyes widened in shock. "I am not an asset," Lucy said, her voice carrying across the tense clearing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She looked directly at Lucian, at the wolf who had ignored her for 20 years. "And I am not your property." She turned her head, her gaze sweeping over the wary faces of the Lycans behind her. "The Silverwood pack cast me out. Their future alpha declared me worthless in front of the goddess and all his people." She faced the envoy again, her chin high. "My loyalty is not to those who threw me away," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "It is to the pack that gave me shelter, and to the alpha who saw value where yours saw none." The Silverwood envoy stared, his mouth agape, completely stunned into silence. Behind her, she heard a sharp intake of breath from Brenna. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had made her choice. As the envoy finally turned, his face pale with fury, and retreated back into the woods, Lucy knew she had not just defied an order. She had signed a declaration of war. That night, the retaliation came. It was not the sound of a formal army, but the sharp, piercing howl of an alarm that echoed through the den. A punitive raid. Kyle was a spoiled child throwing a tantrum, but a child with claws and teeth, and he was determined to prove her choice was a fatal mistake. Reese was a blur of motion, issuing commands as warriors scrambled to their posts. He grabbed Lucy's arm, pulling her not to safety, but back up to the high overlook that had become their command post. The sounds of snarling and the sharp clang of steel on steel echoed up from the forest below. "They're hitting the eastern patrol," Reese said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "A feint?" "I don't know," she breathed, her heart hammering. "Find out," he commanded. She nodded, closing her eyes and letting her consciousness soar. It was easier this time, a familiar path. Her wolf pressed forward, eager to help, to protect. She found the chaos of the fight, the swirl of Silverwood and Shadowfang's scents. She saw through the eyes of a young Shadowfang warrior as he parried a blow. But then she pushed past him, seeking the edges of the fight. And she found it. A second group of Silverwood wolves moving silently through the dense undergrowth, circling around to hit the engaged patrol from behind. It was a classic pincer move, a trap. Her eyes flew open. "It's a trap!" she yelled over the wind. "He's flanking them from the south. A dozen warriors moving fast through the ravine." Without hesitation, Rhys threw his head back and let out a series of short, sharp howls. It wasn't a random sound. It was language. A command. Ambush. South. Turn and face. Down below, the sounds of the battle shifted. The Shadowfang patrol, now alerted, broke from their main engagement and wheeled around, forming a defensive line just as Kale's flanking party burst from the trees. The sounds of surprised snarls and furious fighting erupted. Because of her warning, the trap had failed. As she watched, a surge of fierce, unfamiliar emotion flooded her. It was a primal, protective fury for the Shadowfang warriors fighting and dying below. These were not her enemies. They were hers. Her pack. Her power had not been a curse or a tool for an arrogant boy. It had been a shield. It had saved lives. In the quiet that followed, as the Silverwood raiders were repelled, leaving their wounded behind, the weight of what she had done settled over her. Her choice had just drawn first blood. In the aftermath, the Great Hall was a tense mix of adrenaline, grief, and a strange, newfound respect. Wounded warriors were being tended to, their groans a low counterpoint to the crackling fire. Lucy felt a heavy cloak of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had started this. Now she had to help finish it. As she was helping an elder clean a wound, a figure stopped beside her. It was Brenna. Her left arm was bound in a tight sling, a deep gash visible on her bicep, but her gray eyes were clear. "The South Ravine. They would have torn us to pieces," the beta said, her voice low and gruff. She hesitated. "You saved my patrol. I was wrong about you." Without another word, she turned and walked away, but the admission hung in the air, a peace treaty offered and accepted. Later, once the den had settled into a wary quiet, Rhys found her. He led her to his private study, a room she had never seen before. It was dominated by a massive wooden table covered in maps of the territories, battle plans scrawled on parchment, and small carved wooden figures representing patrols and armies. The air smelled of old paper, ink, and his ever-present scent of ozone and forest. "Show me," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He gestured to the map. "Show me where they were. Show me how he thinks." This was different. He wasn't commanding her. He was consulting her, as if she were his beta, his advisor, his equal. She moved to the table, and as she leaned over the map to point, her hand brushed against his. The air thickened. Time stood still. The bond between them, that constant low hum at the base of her neck, suddenly pulsed with a searing, undeniable heat. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, a jolt of pure, raw desire shot through her, so potent it made her gasp. She looked up, startled, and found him already staring at her, his golden eyes dark and turbulent, filled with an emotion that had nothing to do with war or strategy. Her heart skipped. She could see the same shock, the same dawning hunger, reflected in his gaze. He was the terrifying alpha. He was her captor. He was her protector. And in this moment, under the low light of the candles, he was just a man, looking at a woman. She could meet his gaze without flinching because, for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a subordinate. As the silence stretched, he reached out, his calloused thumb coming up to gently, reverently, brush against the mark on her neck. "It is a part of you now," he murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "But it does not define you. You do." He leaned closer, his scent enveloping her, intoxicating her. Her breath caught. The space between them burned. Her world narrowed to the few inches that separated their lips and the single unspoken question that now felt more dangerous than the entire war with Kale. What was this? The moment hung between them, fragile and crystalline. His scent, ozone, and wild forest was all she could breathe, and his golden eyes held a universe of unspoken things. Her heart skipped. He leaned closer, the last inch of space disappearing, his lips about to meet hers. Boom. A deep, resonant horn blast echoed from the valley, a sound of pure aggression that shattered the tender silence. It was followed by another, and another, a declaration of war. The spell broke. Rhys pulled back instantly, the gentle man disappearing, replaced once more by the formidable Alpha. The intimacy they had almost shared evaporated like mist in a harsh wind. "He's here," Rhys growled, his voice a low, dangerous thing. A full assault. What followed was a frantic rush back to the high overlook. The sight below stole the breath from her lungs. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. Under the cold light of the moon, waves of Silverwood warriors were pouring from the forest's edge, a silver and brown tide of disciplined fury, moving with a terrifying, coordinated purpose. "Their formation is different," Rhys snarled, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "He's using vanguard feints to test the line." He turned to her, his face a hard mask of command. "Lucy, see for me. Where is he trying to break through?" She nodded, the fear and disappointment a cold knot in her stomach. Closing her eyes, she pushed her mind out, seeking the familiar channels of thought, the currents of the warrior's intent. But then she hit it. It was not a wall. It was a storm. A shrieking, chaotic blizzard of psychic static that clawed at her mind, filled with screaming whispers and disorienting colors. Pain, sharp and blinding, exploded behind her eyes. Kale had found a counter. He had found a way to blind her. As the silence roared in her mind, she tried to push through it, but the static only grew louder, more violent. It was like trying to hear a whisper in a hurricane. She could feel the battle raging, feel the fear and fury of the warriors on both sides, but it was a muffled, useless roar. She had no clarity, no foresight. Meanwhile, Kyle's forces, no longer predictable, moved with deadly precision. A weakness in the Shadowfang's western flank was exploited. A shield wall collapsed. The first line of defense was crumbling, and the Shadowfangs were fighting blind, their greatest strategic advantage gone. "Lucy!" Rhys's voice was sharp, cutting through her panic. "Report!" She ripped her consciousness back, a raw scream tearing from her throat as the psychic agony receded. Her body trembled, and cold sweat beaded on her forehead. She looked at him, her eyes wide with terror and failure. "I can't see!" she cried, her voice breaking. He's blocking me. It's just noise. I can't see anything." The look on his face, a flash of disbelief followed by a dawning, strategic horror, was more devastating than any physical blow. Her weapon had just broken in his hand. The battle was no longer a chess match. It was a desperate, bloody brawl. With their foresight gone, the Shadowfangs were forced to rely on pure grit and strength, and the Silverwood pack, better disciplined and organized, was pushing them back foot by bloody foot. The fighting had reached the clearing before the main den, the air thick with the coppery scent of blood and the savage sounds of combat. Lucy, useless as a seer, was now a liability on the overlook. She scrambled down the stone steps, her heart pounding, determined to do something. She joined the elders, helping to drag the wounded away from the front lines, her hands quickly becoming slick with the blood of her new packmates. Her thoughts spun. This was her fault. All of it. If she hadn't been so proud, so quick to prove her power. As if the forest watched, she saw a gap open in the line. A hulking Silverwood warrior, his face a mask of brutal glee, broke through with two others, making a direct line for the caves where the children and non-combatants were sheltered. Before Lucy could even scream a warning, a gray-furred blur shot past her. Brenna. Her injured arm was a non-factor. Her face was a snarl of pure protective fury. She met the three warriors head-on, a whirlwind of claws and teeth. Lucy watched in horror as Brenna fought with the ferocity of a cornered mother. She took down one warrior, her jaws closing on his throat. But the other two were on her. A sword flashed. Brenna cried out, a sharp sound of pain as a deep gash opened on her side. Yet, even so, she saw the second warrior lunge, not at her, but past her, towards Lucy. Without thinking, Brenna threw her wounded body in his path. The warrior's claws, meant for Lucy's heart, ripped through the beta's chest instead. Time stood still. The warrior was immediately brought down by another Lycan, but the damage was done. Brenna collapsed, a pool of dark blood spreading beneath her on the dirt. Other warriors rushed to her side, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. As they carried her away, her fading gray eyes met Lucy's for a fraction of a second, and in them, there was no blame. There was only a sad, final acceptance. That was worse. So much worse. The surrounding Lycans, however, were not so forgiving. Their gazes, as they fell upon Lucy, were filled with raw, undisguised accusation. The trust she had earned had been paid for in blood, and now it was gone. A horn sounded again. Reese's horn. A full retreat. The great stone gates of the den began to close. As the last of the warriors scrambled inside, Reese stood at the entrance, his face carved from granite, his eyes reflecting the fires of the battle. He looked at Lucy, standing alone amidst the chaos, covered in Brenna's blood. His gaze held no anger, no pity. It held only the cold, hard weight of a calculation that had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. The emotional chasm between them was now a canyon, deep and impassable. She was alone in the cold stone room, alone with the sound of her own breathing and the distant, muffled groans of the wounded that echoed through the den like tormented spirits. The air was stale with the smell of blood and defeat. The entire den felt like a tomb she had helped build. Her body was numb. The vibrant, humming bond to Reese was now a dull, cold ache, a constant reminder of her failure. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Because the emptiness inside her was too vast and too absolute for something as simple as tears. Her thoughts spun, each one a nail being hammered into her coffin. Cale was right. He had seen the truth of her from the beginning. Weak, worthless. Reese had been a fool to gamble on her. He had seen a diamond in the dust, but he had been wrong. She wasn't a diamond. She wasn't even dust. She was a curse. A plague that brought ruin to everyone she touched. She had failed the pack. She had failed Brenna. She had failed Reese. She slid down the wall, her limbs heavy and useless, until she was huddled on the floor. She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself small, just like she had in the forest after Cale's rejection. But this was different. This was infinitely worse. Then, she had been the victim of another's cruelty. A tragedy. But now? Now she was the architect of the disaster. Her pride, her foolish belief that her power made her special, had led them all to this. Brenna was dead because of her. The pack was broken because of her. Her core misbelief, the one she had just started to fight, came roaring back with the force of a tidal wave. Her worth was external. It had been tied to her power, and now that her power was gone, she was less than nothing. She was a liability. A black hole that consumed hope and left only devastation in its wake. In the stillness that followed, a single, horrifying certainty settled over her, cold and heavy as a tombstone. She had finally become the worthless thing everyone had always told her she was: silence. The room was a tomb, and she was its only occupant, a ghost haunting the scene of her own demise. She lay curled on the cold stone floor, lost in a vast, gray emptiness. The fire in the hearth had died, leaving only pale, skeletal ashes. Just like the hope inside her. Her core belief, the ugly truth she had carried her whole life, that she was worthless without someone else's validation, had finally been proven right. She was nothing. In the stillness that followed, Her hand, numb and heavy, drifted to her neck, to the cold, dead mark of the bond. She pressed her fingers against it, expecting nothing but the familiar ache of failure. But then, something answered. It was not a thought. It was not a vision. It was a faint, impossibly distant echo, a pulse, faint as a star in a cloudy sky. But it was there. It wasn't her power. That part of her was silent, suffocated by Kale's magical shroud. No, this was something else. This was him. As if pulled by a string, her consciousness, what little was left of it, focused on that tiny spark. She reached for it, not with the practiced skill of a dreamwalker, but with the raw, desperate instinct of a drowning soul. The bond was a two-way street, a direct line. And on the other end of that line, she felt him. She felt the crushing weight of his duties as Alpha, the sharp, bitter grief for Brenna, the cold fury at his own tactical failure. She felt his fear for his pack, a fear so profound it was a physical weight. And beneath it all, she felt his faith, a stubborn, unwavering, impossible belief in her. Not in the dreamwalker, not in the weapon. In Lucy. He had not given up on her, even when she had so completely given up on herself. Her world tilted for a third time. Not with the shock of a prophecy fulfilled, not with the agony of rejection, but with the fragile, terrifying dawn of a new kind of hope. It was a hope that didn't come from a seer or a fated bond, but from the choice of another, to believe in her, even at her absolute worst. The strength wasn't just in her magic. It was in the connection itself. It was in the simple, brutal act of getting back up one more time. As if fate demanded it, a new resolve, quiet as steel and twice as strong, began to form in the hollow space inside her. She pushed herself up from the floor, her limbs shaking but obedient. Her eyes, when she opened them, were clear. The despair was gone, burned away by that single, distant spark of faith. The girl who had collapsed on this floor was gone forever. She knew what she had to do. She found Reese in the armory. The air was thick with the scent of whetstones, steel, and his own contained grief. He stood alone, methodically sharpening a massive, double-edged broadsword, the rhythmic scrape of stone against metal the only sound. His movements were precise, economical, but his shoulders were tight with a tension that spoke of a terrible burden. He looked up as she entered, his golden eyes hard and weary. He expected tears, apologies, or perhaps just the same empty despair he had seen in her earlier. He got none of them. She walked directly to him, her step steady. "You were wrong," she said, her voice quiet but firm. His hand stilled. A dangerous light entered his eyes. "Was I?" "Yes," she said, meeting his gaze without fear. "I'm not your weapon." Before he could react, she pressed on. "A weapon is a tool. It has no will of its own. It only does what it's told." She took a deep breath. "I'm going to be the one who decides how this ends." The confusion on his face was plain. "My magic is gone, Reese. Kale has it blocked, but I don't need it." She tapped her temple. "I have something better. I have him. I spent my entire life watching him, learning him. I know his pride. I know his arrogance. I know his desperate, pathetic need to be seen as the conqueror." She laid out a new plan. A plan born not of magic, but of pain and intimate knowledge. A psychological trap. "Let me go to him," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let me escape. I will play the part of the broken, terrified Omega he expects me to be. I will feed his ego, let him believe he has won, that he has crushed me completely." She would not be his asset. She would not be his prize. She would be his undoing. Reese stared at her, the sword forgotten in his hands. He was seeing a transformation more profound than any shift from human to wolf. He was seeing a spirit reforged in the fires of utter failure. The broken girl was gone, and in her place stood a queen of shadows, her pain now honed into a sharp, deadly weapon. "It will put you directly in his hands," he warned, his voice a low growl of concern. "If you are wrong—" "I'm not," she said, her voice as cold and hard as the blade in his hand. A small, dangerous smile touched her lips for the first time. "That's where he's weakest." He searched her eyes and saw no fear, only a chilling, absolute certainty. After a long, silent moment, he gave a single, sharp nod. Their new alliance was forged, not on his power or her magic, but on her mind and his trust. The pre-dawn mist was a cold, wet shroud, clinging to the forest and muffling all sound. It was the perfect cover. From the shadows of the great gate, Rhys and the last of his warriors watched as Lucy, clad in a simple, torn tunic, stumbled out of the den. Her performance was masterful. She cast terrified glances over her shoulder, her body language that of a panicked, fleeing animal. She ran, not with the mindless terror of her first flight, but with a cold, deliberate purpose. She made sure to be clumsy, leaving a clear trail. She allowed the scent of her fear, part real, part memory, to drift on the wind. It was a calculated invitation, a baited hook. As the sky began to lighten from black to a bruised purple, she heard it, the distant howl of a Silverwood scout. They had seen her. They had taken the bait. The chase was on. The tension was a living thing, a knot tightening in her stomach with every step. She pushed herself harder, her breath coming in ragged, convincing gasps. She could feel them closing in, their confident strides a stark contrast to her feigned desperation. She had to make this believable. She had to let them see her break. She chose her stage well, a small, rocky clearing, eerily similar to the one where she had been rejected. As the first Silverwood warriors burst through the trees, she let out a theatrical cry of despair and collapsed to her knees, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with racking, silent sobs. She presented them with the perfect picture of a defeated, broken creature. The warriors circled her, their expressions a mixture of triumph and contempt. Then they parted. Kyle stepped into the clearing. He looked every bit the conquering alpha, his golden hair glowing in the first light of dawn, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He strode toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel, the sound like a countdown to her doom. He stopped just before her, looming over her pathetic, kneeling form. "Did you really think you could escape me?" he asked, his voice dripping with indulgent condescension. He reached out, grabbing a fistful of her hair and forcing her head up to look at him. His eyes roamed over her, taking in her torn clothes, her tear-streaked face, her trembling body. He smiled, a cruel, possessive curve of his lips. "You belong to me," he whispered, savoring his victory. And Lucy, looking up at him through a veil of carefully crafted tears, let him believe it. Kale's triumphant smile was the ugliest thing she had ever seen. He held her by the hair, a trophy for his warriors to admire, and brandished the heavy iron collar like a crown. "Did you really think you could escape me?" he whispered, his voice a sickening mix of condescension and desire. "You belong to me." He moved to fasten the cold metal around her neck. This was it, the final humiliation, the end of her. And she let it happen. For one more second, she let him believe he had won. But then the trembling stopped. The tears dried on her cheeks. Her body went still. She lifted her head, and the look in her eyes was not that of a broken omega. It was the flat, cold, terrifying calm of a predator that had just lured its prey into the perfect trap. "My place," she said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper that cut through his smugness, "was never with you." Kale's eyes widened in confusion. That single moment of hesitation was all she needed. She didn't scream for help. She didn't fight him physically. Instead, she slammed her consciousness through the bond that connected her to Rhys, a silent, desperate roar. Now. At the same time, she unleashed the truth, her words a volley of poisoned arrows aimed directly at his fragile pride. "You're not a conqueror, Kale. You're a coward." His grip loosened in shock. "You weren't strong enough to accept a fated bond, so you tried to break it. You weren't clever enough to see my power, so you tried to steal it." She rose to her feet, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. "You are nothing but a spoiled child, terrified of anything you can't control." As her final words struck him, the forest exploded. From the shadows, a tide of black fur and silent fury erupted. Reese and the Shadowfang warriors burst into the clearing, their movements a coordinated, deadly dance. The Silverwood pack, caught completely off guard, scrambled to form a defense. Chaos erupted. Snarls and the shriek of steel filled the air. Kyle, his face a mask of enraged humiliation, forgot the battle, forgot everything but her. He lunged, his claws extended. "You bitch!" But as if summoned, a black shadow intercepted him. Reese met him head-on, and the clash between the two alphas was a thing of brutal, primal power. While they fought a desperate struggle of gold against shadow, Lucy turned her attention to the real source of her failure, the psychic shroud. She could feel the sorcerer, hidden at the edge of the clearing, his mind a knot of panicked energy. She closed her eyes, anchored herself to the steady, powerful presence of Reese through their bond, and pushed. She didn't try to see through the static. She gathered all her pain, all her rage, all her newfound will, and used it to unravel the spell from the inside out. With a final silent scream of pure will, the shroud shattered. The psychic silence was broken. Clarity returned. The battle turned into a rout. Reese, his strength and fury unmatched, slammed a stunned Kale to the ground, leaving him broken and bleeding at his feet. The Silverwood warriors, their alpha defeated and their lines broken, dropped their weapons and surrendered. In the quiet that followed, Lucy stood tall, breathing in the cold, clean air of her victory. She had not won with magic she was given. She had won with the strength she had clawed for, the knowledge she had earned, and the choice she had made. The clearing was a wreck of broken branches and broken bodies. The sounds of fighting died away, replaced by the heavy panting of the victors and the low moans of the wounded. Reese stood over Kale, a conquering alpha, his foot on the chest of his rival. The air was thick with the scent of blood and impending justice. He looked at Lucy, his golden eyes asking the unspoken question. What is his fate? It was her right to decide. The pack law was clear. The entire Shadowfang pack watched her, waiting. A growl rose from one of the warriors. "Kill him! He is a snake who would bite us again!" The old Lucy, the Omega girl who had cried by the creek, would have agreed. She would have wanted vengeance. She would have wanted him to feel the pain she had felt. But as she looked down at the pathetic, bleeding man on the ground, she felt nothing but a vast, empty pity. He wasn't a monster. He was just small. She shook her head. Walking forward until she stood beside Reese, she looked down at the man who had shattered her world. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the silent clearing. "Death is too easy. It's an escape." She knelt, forcing Kale to look at her, to see the woman he had created from the girl he had destroyed. "You will live," she declared, her words the judgment of a queen. "You will live without a pack, without a title, stripped of your alpha status. You will live as an outcast, a lone wolf with no one to command and no one to praise you. You will live every day with the memory that the weak, worthless Omega you cast aside was the one who brought you to ruin." She stood up. "Get him out of my sight." Without another word, she turned her back on him, the gesture of final, absolute dismissal. She walked away from the past and toward her future, moving among the wounded Shadowfangs, offering a healing touch, a quiet word. She found the warriors from Brenna's patrol, their faces grim, but their eyes holding a new, fierce loyalty. A silent understanding passed between them. She was one of them now. Truly. Months later, the first snows of winter were blanketing the mountains, covering the scars of the old battles in a layer of pure, clean white. Lucy stood on the high overlook, but she was not the same woman who had trembled there in fear. She wore dark, functional Shadowfang leathers, and her hair was braided back, practical and severe. There was a quiet confidence in her stance, a stillness in her soul that she had never known. Her dreamwalker ability was no longer a chaotic storm, but a calm, flowing river, a sense she could use to feel the health and contentment of the pack below. She was not a weapon. She was a guardian. The crunch of boots on snow announced his arrival. Reese came to stand beside her, the easy, familiar comfort between them a silent testament to everything they had endured. He no longer loomed. He stood with her. The bond between them was not a chain, but a quiet, powerful harmony. "What do you see?" he asked, his voice a low, soft rumble. A gentle smile touched her lips. "I see a new patrol of pups, getting too close to the river," she murmured. "I see the stores are full for the winter. I see the Silverwood wolves we took in, training with our own." She paused. "I see peace." He took her hand, his large, calloused fingers lacing through hers. "I was wrong," he said, his voice filled with a raw sincerity. He turned her to face him, his golden eyes, once so terrifying, now warm with an emotion that made her heart ache in the best possible way. "When I saw you that night, I saw a weapon to save my pack from my past." He lifted her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I was a fool," he whispered. "I didn't find a weapon. I found a queen to lead us into the future." And then he kissed her. It wasn't the desperate, questioning kiss they had almost shared. It was a kiss of equals, a kiss of partners. It was a kiss that spoke of shared battles, of profound respect, and of a love that had not been fated by the moon, but forged in fire, shadow, and choice. Her soul answered. Her world settled. And just like that, everything was finally perfectly right.